Now it should work. Audio input capture. There we go. Oh my gosh. Now it should work. Audio input capture. There we go. Well, shit. It was recording. Oh my gosh. So I'll probably now it should work. I'll probably just start here. Audio input capture. There we go. Well, shit. It was recording. Oh my gosh. So I'll probably now just start talking for like 15 minutes. But that's okay. I'll probably just start here. Audio input capture. There we go. Well, shit. It was recording. Oh my gosh. So I'll probably now it should work. For like 15 minutes. But that's okay. I'll probably just start here. Audio input capture. There we go. Well, shit. It was recording. Oh my gosh. So I'll probably now it should work. For 15 minutes. But that's okay. I'll probably just start here. Audio input capture. There we go. Well, shit. It was recording. Oh my gosh. So I'll probably now it should work. For 15 minutes. But that's okay. I'll probably just start here. H-1B visas and immigration. And it's all anyone's been talking about on the right wing for the last 2 days. So I thought I'd weigh in. It's a big conversation, and it's one that's been going on for not just the last couple days, but the last couple decades, really. And it's unfortunately devolved into a bunch of like racism going in both directions. People calling each other Pajits and stupid white boy and this and that and the other. And I mean, obviously those kinds of racial slurs don't do anything to help like figure things out. But neither does just focusing upon the racism and being like, oh, these people are terrible racists. And a lot of the libertarians participants, the sort of tech bros, are doing that now. They're just like, oh my gosh, I've seen the racist underbelly. Scott Adams was like, I can understand Indians quitting the Republican Party now. It's okay, and you're trying to persuade them to do that. You're trying to achieve a rhetorical middle ground here. You're posturing. That's fine, but like that's not any better. So it's worth looking at the arguments that people like Vivek and Elon Musk are making, and the arguments that people like Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec are making, and talking about them in the broader sense. So the background here is Elon Musk made a post basically saying we need to bring in the best tech workers from wherever we can find them. The claim is that there's a huge labor shortage in the tech world, with engineers specifically, but everything digital, that coders, programmers, networkers, like that whole world, there's a huge labor shortage, supposedly. So we need to import more labor. And this was met with a huge pushback, a huge wave of resistance from the right-wing base, who generally likes Elon, generally likes Vivek, generally likes a lot of these guys, and is like, replacing our labor force is not a win for America. It's a win for someone, but it's not a win for us, and so what it comes down to is the sides that have emerged on the right, and I think it makes sense to talk about it in this term. It is you have the sort of libertarian meritocrats on one side, whose focus is on excellence, and on the other side, you have the paleocon loyalists, whose focus is upon duty and what we might call jurisdiction and sovereign obligation. Who do we have loyalty to? Now, as you can probably tell by my framing, I don't view this as like good guys versus bad guys. Here we have two competing virtues. Who doesn't love excellence? But excellence for whom, right? Loyalty and duty are also important and matter. And so it's a very fascinating debate. And I thought the person who had actually had the best take on this whole thing on X, before we get into details, was, of all people, Cenk Uygur, who looked at this and said, I love seeing this argument because it demonstrates that MAGA is not some like culty monolith with that just gets their opinions from on high. They think on their own, and they're willing to disagree with their supposed leaders. And it was a real. I think anyone who thinks the left has been so successful for the last 100 years because they were all in lockstep agreement doesn't know anything about the left. They've been constantly disagreeing and bickering with each other as much, and I think this kind of disagreement is healthy and helpful. But obviously, focusing, throwing the racial epithets, calling all these Indian immigrants H-1B visas, Pajits, or the Indians firing back, oh, you stupid white boy, you can't even reproduce or whatever. Like, obviously that's not helpful. But it's not any more helpful to just point to the ugliest participants and dismiss the whole thing as not worthwhile. Like that is just as bad as doing the racist, ugly stuff yourself. So let's put that stuff aside and focus on what are the good arguments in both sides. What's the backstory here? What's the what are the serious things we should be focusing on? Now, so the claim that Elon Musk is saying, and sort of the justification for saying we really need to fill this labor shortage in the tech world, is that we are in a sort of AI tech battle with Russia, with China, with the rest of the world, for control of all this new technology, all this AI stuff. And if we don't win that race, someone else is going to win the race, and that's not going to be good. So we have to take charge. We have to win this. Our time is now. We've got to jump in on this. That might be true, might not be true. Kind of hard for people outside of the tech space to gauge how urgent this is. Could be really urgent, and if we underestimate it, the price could be fairly dire. But it might be a little overblown too. Just something to consider as a possibility. But let's put the tech stuff on hold for a moment and focus back on immigration more broadly. In 1965, the United States passed the Hart-Celler Act, which dramatically increased immigration levels in the United States. Between then and now, I'll have to double check my numbers. I'm sure someone can double check me here. The United States has received something like 70 or 80 million immigrants in a little under 70 years, which is, as Vox Day and Red Eagle point out in their book Cuckservative, this is the largest and fastest migration of human beings in all of history. All of history. There's never been a larger or faster movement of people to one place, ever. Now, historically, according to Martin Van Crevel, an Israeli military historian, in one of his essays that was published in There Will Be War, which was a study on the relationship between migration and warfare. In many cases, in fact, if not most cases, the relationship between migration and war is close to 1-1. Either migration is the result of war or migration causes war, but in some cases, migration is actually identical with war. In other words, what was migration is later talked about by historians as a war or as an invasion. For example, like the Hunnic movement across the steppe, like those weren't just military horse raiders. They were bringing their families and children and villages with them, a lot of the Native American migrations of the tribes, a lot of the African, the Bantu tribes moving across the continent. Those were migrations, but we talk about them as war because of the consequences over the course of the centuries that those migrations happened. So, given that the United States has received the largest movement of foreign people into their land in all of human history, and in the fastest time frame as well, we are sitting on a time bomb as far as civil unrest and conflict is concerned. Now, that doesn't guarantee that powder keg blows off. Anything could happen. But it's a very urgent and dire situation, historically speaking. Now, when we compare that urgency and the scale of the immigration problem that the United States is currently sitting on to the labor shortage in the tech world. To me, it feels like the immigration problem, which is really a cultural cohesion problem. And it's not one that can't be fixed in some way, but it desperately needs to be addressed, like even more than the debt. The tech labor shortage, I would question how urgent is this exactly? I get that it looks very urgent to the people within tech, but there are other problems that their solution, and we'll get to whether it's a solution or not in a minute, impacts other things outside of their domain. And people have a right to be concerned about those other things. So this historical context of immigration in the United States over the last 70 years is a big thing that we have to remember when discussing H-1B visas, work visas, and these other sorts of things. Now, there's an economic question here as well, which is, the tech sector is saying, we have a labor shortage, so we need more labor. In the 1970s, I think earlier than that, actually, probably the 60s, Friedrich Hayek wrote a fairly famous critique of the socialist price fixing strategy. And he said the problem with their price fixing strategy, the Soviet communist strategy, is that it eliminates market signals. It prevents the market from being able to communicate with itself about the proper value of things. And so you would end up with shortages, and you'd end up with ridiculous wasteful surpluses because there was bad signals. People weren't getting the right price signals that would move labor or capital around to where it needed to be. So they're complaining now that there is this labor shortage in tech. And the tacit claim is that there's just been such a huge explosion in tech recently that they just didn't have enough training. But some of the people are claiming, no, American education has prevented people from being trained, or maybe, as Vivek puts it, we have the wrong cultural values. We've been pushing a bunch of social media influencers instead of like math and science and stuff. Historically, that has not been the case in the United States. White Americans have been quite interested in math and science and engineering and so forth. Maybe a more likely reason why American citizens have not been getting as much of that kind of training is because they've been systematically pushing out white males. There is an unfortunate but inevitable ethnic component to this, and they've been systematically pushed out of that. So, and it's not the same people. It's not like the Department of Education are not the same people as these engineering firms, Elon Musk, Vivek, or whoever, who are now looking for engineers to find. And oh my gosh, the Department of Education screwed up our STEM core. But there are some other possibilities too. We've been importing labor for a while, and I brought up Hayek's price signaling argument because when you import labor, it accomplishes the same result. You fail to signal the price, the value of an engineer at X firm to the public. There's a miscommunication or a bad signal, and people you don't get the influx of people. And of course, this is because these companies don't want to pay as much, obviously, because the signal is more money. We are getting basically labor inflation, and this can actually cause its own problems. It can create a labor bubble, which would be its own issue. But I wanted to put in this price signaling problem, because I think it's a big subject, and I think it's an under-addressed subject in this broader conversation. Now, all of these points I'm making about the historical danger we're already sitting on, and the economic dangers of manipulating labor supply in order to meet a demand, which is not really a labor shortage so much as it is a like an unwillingness to pay the money for it. Maybe there just aren't enough people, but you know, I find that hard to believe, because I know of, you know, engineers and people in that tech world who have a tough time finding jobs, and some of it is you know, incentives that were put in place, like I mentioned before, government programs, DEI programs that pushed out many people, and so now they're kind of getting you know, lying in the bed they made and complaining about it. Again, sometimes not the same people, but you're not necessarily helping yourself in the long run by creating short-term fixes with their own sets of side effects in the current in the present. And it's especially, it triggers, I think, people's feelings of injustice when the people who were pushed out over the last 30 years are now being kind of doubly punished by being replaced in their own labor market, and on top of that, blamed for it, for not having their culture right or whatever. So, and I think the people who have this sense of injustice and get a little pissy with Vivek Ramaswamy are justified in their anger about that. I think that makes sense. Now, none of that addresses Elon Musk's core claim, which is that, like, really what matters is the top 0.01% best engineers. And, you know, immigration in itself is not a bad thing. And people forget the American rocket program of the 20th century. It's not done by Americans. Someone messaged me on X and said Werner von Braun was as American as apple strudel, and I thought that was a perfect take. There is a point to be made here against the ethno-nationalists who say it's all like ethnos. It's all about the nation and loyalty to your people and stuff. If you go back in history, in any place in the world, and find a single population, there is no such thing as an ethnically pure people. Every people on the planet are the product of immigration and blending of cultures. Now, I'm not saying that therefore all people are equal or any of this other nonsense. I'm not trying to equivocate and act like an immigrant from one country is the same as an immigrant from another country, because that's a stupid argument. That's a very stupid argument. But it establishes a sort of metaphysical baseline about what do we actually care about here. Our nations are like the ship of Theseus in a way. You know, over time, every single board gets replaced. Every bit gets replaced, and at a certain point, you're like, is it the same ship? Could it even be the same ship? But, you know, there is a huge difference and an experiential difference between, you know, slowly repairing a ship over hundreds of years and replacing every board that gets rotten and everything, and even upgrading bits every once in a while, putting in an engine or whatever, versus just wholesale ripping out large parts of the boat and, you know, putting in entirely new parts very, very quickly. There's a rate of replacement that shifts a ship of Theseus experience into I just got rid of a boat and replaced it with a new boat experience. What we're talking about when we talk about national identity is the experience of cohesion and the experience of being at home in a place. And some amount of immigration has always been a part of that. The question is not immigration or no immigration, although there is a case to be made that given the last 70 years, it might make sense to cut it off for a few decades. But the question in principle is what's a reasonable rate of immigration? And what Elon Musk is talking about the top 0.01% or whatever, is not that's just common sense, as far as I can tell. But many of the people who are taking his side in the libertarian tech bro argument for meritocracy are making a much broader argument. Something like 19% of engineers and tech workers in the United States are foreign workers. That's a lot. That's a ton. And there are not healthy side effects to that maybe for the tech sector itself, certainly for parts of the country outside of the tech sector. And it has everything to do with the native population feeling at home in their own country, and violating that rate rule, whatever it is. And that's something we need to negotiate. The conservatives don't have the right to just say, this is what it is, and it's like, 0.02% or something Spartan like that. Sparta is the one country that Machiavelli claimed died from insufficient immigration. Most other countries suffer the other problem. So yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion. I think I think all the people who are complaining about, it's so divisive, are much adoing about nothing. This is healthy. This is good. And I will conclude before I get to the comments here. Taylor has said some interesting things, which I will get to in a moment. I will conclude just to keep things a little bit spicy, because that's fun. Maybe there's an argument here for a little bit of Pajit and white boy racism. Very spicy. And that is this. There are three core ethnic populations to the United States. There are the Puritan descendants of the Anglo colonists from the 16th century. There are the Amerindian tribes, and there are the descendants of black slaves. Those are the three core ethnic, I'm doing the German thing, the three core ethnic populations of the United States. But those aren't the only Americans. What about the Italians? What about the Irish? What about the Germans who are all and have been here for generations? Are we going to be like ideological and say, no, those are not Americans because they don't fit into my categorical conceptualization of what an American ethnos is? No, we feel at home with these populations. They've been here for a while. They have integrated into the experience of America. They're a part of that now. So there's an integration process, and the identity that they have become a part of protects its own identity in order to remain itself. All of the populations that came through here experienced racism. Also, the populations that came here originally, including the blacks, the Puritans, and the Amerindians experienced racism. If one reads the Last of the Mohicans, you will see a bunch of intra-white racism between Irish and English and Scots, and intra-Native American racism. Oh, the Mohawks are a thievish race, says the Iroquois or whatever. And every subsequent population that came through here and became American, earned the right to become American through a sort of trial by fire, what one might say hazing. And that sounds mild unless you've been hazed in the military. But and military is, I think, a good example. We have the famous scene from Full Metal Jacket where the drill instructor informs all the recruits in the full gamut of ethnic slurs. I don't care what you are, you wop kike, whatever, this, that, the other. You're all equally worthless in my army, you know. And it's a breaking down of the old identity in order to forge a new identity. So am I saying hazing is necessary in order to turn someone into American? I don't know. It's an interesting idea to think about. But what I think is far more certain is that if an identity, like being an American, and it has to mean something to be an American, it has to be a certain way of life, a certain way of living, a certain set of preferences, a way of being that is American, that defends itself as itself against outside impositions for an immigrant to integrate into, to become. If there's nothing to become, then they can't become Americans. So the lack of some pushback is in its own way robbing them of the opportunity to become Americans if they want to do that. And if they don't want to do it, then it's robbing America of its own immune system against that kind of thing. So one could make an argument that the Irish were perhaps the most graceful in the acceptance of this abuse. I liken it to, I once made an argument that was only semi-joking on the blog that fireworks should be illegal on 4th of July because when they're illegal, it's more American to do it. I think any German listening to this be like, what? That makes no sense. If you want to do it, you want it to be legal, or you don't do it. Americans get it, though. Americans find it funny and maybe even agree in a not so funny way. And that's what it means to be a part of this. And you sense this in immigrants who've come here and who get it, and some of them who don't. So anyways, that's my controversial food for thought, throwing out this debate, which I think is very interesting. You should all follow it on X and take it seriously, and don't get caught up in the lowbrow stuff. It's fun, but it's not the important stuff. And if you're dismissing people because there's racists on the other side, you're just as bad as the people who are pushing back using racial slurs like frickin' 12-year-old Call of Duty players. Don't do that. It's lowbrow, but have fun, be a good civic participant, and enjoy the show.